Prevenient grace. We know in the Wesleyan order of salvation that when we study our tradition, especially our doctrine, we need to move from prevenient grace, justifying grace, and sanctifying grace. In some ways, we think about that in terms of moving through the process into ministry, that we have to be agile in our description of those various forms of grace. But let's think a moment about the importance of prevenient grace to the Wesleyan movement. Prevenient grace, the grace of God that comes prior to our seeking it, the grace of God that is poured out upon all people. It's a fundamental principle of the Wesleyan movement. Freedom to respond to that grace is essential. The universality of that grace is fundamental. The capacity to respond is human. And it is in that constancy of responding and yielding to and living out of that grace that the vibrancy and the vitality of the Wesleyan movement, which is at the heart of the United Methodist Church, that is also part of the vibrancy of the relationship with God that was in community in the Evangelical United Brethren. These two things reinforced within the context of the very spirit and heart of our denominational life. Prevenient grace. And the critical piece, as a professor of church leadership, one who studies church leadership, one who has lived within the church, is that there needs to be an alignment between what is our fundamental value, not only our ethics, but our fundamental values about what God is doing with us, and to think about how it is in the way we organize that we are aligned with our theology. So, prevenient grace. Mr. Wesley, in formulating the Methodist societies, happened upon, and you see this in United Methodist history, the class meeting. Now, it wasn't a stroke of genius that the class meeting was there to be the fundamental place to respond to the grace of God. The class meeting was a way that was proposed in order to basically defray the debt. It was in the class meeting that people would make their pledges and in which the money was collected. But the class meeting became the very heart and soul and the locus of the Methodist movement and the Methodist revival. Why? Because everybody was invited to be part of a class meeting in a knowable communion one with another. And its purpose was to intentionally seek and respond to God's grace that had already been poured out on us. God's grace is poured out. The Methodist movement is based on a place where Methodists could respond. Pouring out and response. Class meetings. Everybody's in a class meeting. Pouring out and response. This became the heart, from my perspective, of the polity, the governance, the very formation of Methodist ecclesiology. And so it is for us today, a very clear and important piece to struggle with when we have a church that is brought into being, not focused on in terms of prevenient grace, but is brought into being constitutionally, and that it is legislation at the hierarchical level and decisions that are made at the hierarchical level that actually come down to the local church. Throughout most of my ministry, I was in New England, where Congregationalism was the most important Protestant governance and visibility. And many of our bishops used to say to us, "We are not Congregationalists," meaning that we are connected to a larger connection and to the bishop. I struggled with that only in the sense that it is not that the locus and focus of our theology is in the hierarchy, but in fact in Mr. Wesley's time, and I think edifying for our own, it was not even in the congregation, it was in the smaller cell group, because it was there that the intentionality of response to what God was pouring out was very important. And I think this is going to be a challenge for us as we go forward in terms of our fundamental profession about the prevenient grace of God. It doesn't just happen to the individual. It's not simply about the heart being strangely warmed. It's about God's prevenient grace, how it works on the human being in community in which it is accountable, in which it is reported, in which is reflected upon in relationship to the other responses to the prevenience of grace. That was the class meeting. But then what happened to it? Was it confidential so nobody else knew? I think Jesus has a harsh thing to say about that. That's like hiding your light under a bushel. No, of course not. The class leader, in communion with other class leaders, talked about the fruit of the class. What are we therefore to do as class leaders together? And the stewards who would speak to the circuit riders. And so therefore you had from God to the class, connected. And that is how the formulation of mission at every level was done. It started with God, but in its most universal place, the class meeting. And I think that's a fundamental concept that we must struggle with in terms of what you're writing in your papers, what many people feel about the denomination, and that is that those decisions are not being made in response to God in a way that we understand them, except in the isolation of our prayer closet or the isolation of a small group that we might be in at church, but we want to keep those things private or confidential. And so the work that we do with God individually and in community gets hidden under a bushel. It's got biblical implications and guidance about that. So a question that I struggle with, and I'll invite you to struggle with me about that, is how do we take what is the connectional system but has become centralized in the General Conference, where legislation brings things into being, as we talked about last week in terms of the Constitution. But that grew out of this initial impulse, which really is about the heart set free to respond to God in connected and knowable community, in another connected and knowable community, and there's responsibility back and forth. And so that mission develops and is connected and is aligned all the way along the connection. And realistically, instead of it being hierarchical, it becomes a prototype, actually, for a flattened hierarchy. That really it's more about connection than it is about connection. But as we grew, especially in this country, and as we mimicked and sought other models, the hierarchies of government and the hierarchies of business became really important to us. And so I've heard several in our connection talk about the connection not being one to another, but the connection is actually to the episcopal officer. Dramatically hierarchical. And that our covenant is with that officer, dramatically hierarchical. When I think about our baptismal vows, I think about the prevenience of God's grace, I think about the models of the class meeting, I think about the connection of the clergy one to another. These were heartfelt vows that we shared a similar calling. There was a flattened and connected hierarchy. Oh yes, there was loyalty. Oh yes, there was obedience to those who sent. Oh yes, those things too are inherent within our model of church governance. But think with me about the priority and the primacy that we have within this denomination, about the prevenient nature of grace, and that we provide the environment fortified by our governance for people to respond to that, connected one to another. I would say that we live this out, and we can see this fundamentally in one of the most successful programs of late in the United Methodist Church, which is Volunteers in Mission. The prevenient grace of God and the call to the mission field is not simply a matter of giving one's money to a philanthropic society that sends missionaries, important as that has been. But really, the Volunteers in Mission, that we hear a call and feel a burden to go to particular places all over the world. And if there's a disaster, you see that we come even more quickly. The numbers of United Methodists, among especially our youth, who have gone down into the Gulf in order to respond to Hurricane Katrina. The reports that I get on Facebook all the time of local churches who are going in mission, these are multiplying over and over and over again. Many churches, Volunteers in Mission. We have a local mission, we have a regional mission, a national mission, an international mission. Prevenient grace of God at all levels, connected one to another, a place to respond to what God is doing. We are going to struggle with how to align best our resources and our governance. And I would say it's not only in response to the mission field, as Volunteers in Mission has done, but what is the direction of our church? How do we together continue to be an inclusive church as it is in our Constitution? How do we listen to one another as with the heart? How do we listen to God? How does it come from God? And basically, we are United Methodist Christians together. We have found that if we wait until we get to the constitutional level of voting this as legislation, that at this moment, as has happened several times in our past, we are in great danger of simply falling into political parties, advocating our own political points of view, important as they are, theologically grounded as they are, just as they are, pious and faithful as they are. Think about the prevenient grace of God. It's inherent in the class meeting. And in the United States, it is inherent in the camp meeting, which you will also hear about in United Methodist history. But I will remind us that the power of the camp meeting that began with the Presbyterians, but grew with the Methodists, that the fundamental proclamation was that the grace of God was given and poured out on everybody. Everybody. Not simply the elect, not simply a group of elites that made decisions on behalf of us all, but was poured out on everybody. Which is why the camp meeting thrived on the frontier, a place where the non-elect, if you will, went to find a new life. This notion of Methodists together, of Christians together, proclaiming that grace of God and spending weeks together, responding to that in fellowship with that, and you know that history. So the question that I struggle with, and will be struggling with in my sabbatical coming up here shortly, has to do with the prevenient grace of God as primary, and how it is that in our polity we can align ourselves more effectively in order to respond to that grace in all of our parts. And I would hope that you would think about that with me, because it has a poignant pungent and an important missional and justice edge, as much as it does our piety, our devotion to God, and our love divine, all loves excelling for one another. And as we end this section and throughout this hour together, I want us to think about that hymn. And so, if you are struggling finding hymns for the assignment in your reflection, this week is a gimme. Use Love Divine, All Loves Excelling. Because it is about the prevenient grace of God. It is really our doctrine in song, which is the way Methodists basically sing their doctrine. As a pastoral note, I will say to you, what amazes me most is in all the years that I was in pastoral ministry, when I would visit people in the hospital or in their homes, and they were near what was called in Wesley's time the article of death. Clearly they would ask me to pray. But more often than not, if it wasn't a scripture that was upon my heart, which was generally the 23rd Psalm, they would ask me to sing. And it was a Wesley hymn. So think about this as part of our governance. We begin with Love Divine, All Loves Excelling, joy of heaven to earth come down. Fix in us thy humble dwelling. All thy faithful mercies crown. Jesus, thou art all compassion. Doesn't that have missional implications? Joy unbounded, love thou art. And as you come to the end of the hymn, this really does talk about our mission and how we live it out together. And if we are not aligned to do this, we are out of alignment with the prevenient grace of God, and out of alignment is the way we experience God working with us. Finish then thy new creation. Finish then. Prevenient grace.
Love divine, greater than any other, brings the joy of heaven down. Live in us, we long to be your dwelling. From our hearts let praise resound. Jesus, you are God's pure love defined.
The conference. Many people who go to conference today, it is a place of business. It is the place that gives you your credentials or your orders. It is the place where budgets are voted. All of those things may be important to us. But as we were talking about the prevenient grace of God, let me say a couple of words about the importance of conference as a spiritual discipline. That was still a remnant that was present when I was growing up. I grew up in a Methodist family. My grandparents were lay leaders throughout their lives. My grandmother in the Women's Society for Christian Service, and she thought that title was very important, the Women's Society for Christian Service, and was very upset when that became the United Methodist Women, because there was not in the title that notion of the mission of Christian service. Anyway, that populated our dining room table around the time of the merger and the renaming of the United Methodist Women. But I simply want to have you hear that, the Women's Society for Christian Service. And my grandmother, my grandfather as well, but I'll say a word about my grandmother because for many of us, being Methodist is a very familial thing, especially in those days. And if we weren't born and raised as Methodists, that was fine. But you were brought into this sense that this is a tightly knit, loving yet growing group of folk. They love God, they love Jesus, they love their church, they love to be in mission and ministry. Not only in their local setting, but it opened the world to go to conference and to send those from your local conference off to jurisdictional and general conference. It was a connection with the ministry of Jesus Christ in the world. And there was a sense when I was growing up, and I think that this was true for Methodists for the first 150 years or so, and there's a wonderful book that was written about a decade ago that says, "The way of the cross leads home." And that is that conference had to do with a fundamental question. How are we to live as Christians in the reality of the life that we live? And we often talk about the conference starting in the local church, a charge conference, but throughout a lot of our history, the conference actually started around the dinner table. It was a family conference. How are we then to live as Christians? I grew up, and you've heard these stories. You're not supposed to smoke. You're not supposed to drink. You don't play cards on Sunday. Some families were more strict. They didn't play cards at all. But the question is not that which for many of us is a little laughable today, although it shouldn't be as laughable as all that. But it was this constancy of that question. How are we then to live in response to God's grace in our lives? And that grace was living and palpable, and it was shared. So not only was it part of what was going on in that family, that we are like that, as if our family is kind of the elect and special and all of that kind of stuff, it was then broadened to the neighborhood, to those who went to church as Methodists, but also, the others. We had aunts and uncles who were Lutherans, cousins that were Baptists, others who were Congregationalists. But it was that same methodology, that question of the response to the grace of God, and in the local church as well. What are we then to do? And it was very interesting to notice that in my family's reality, and this happened throughout the connection, what happened is a concern around the dinner table for single mother head of households, especially after World War II. Those who had become widowed and orphaned because of the war. And then there were those who had children out of wedlock, which of course was not looked upon very well by the church, but still, these were children of God. Out of those conversations around the table and in the neighborhood and in the Women's Society of Christian Service at the local church, and from the Women's Society of Christian Service to other denominations, my grandmother, who just had finished the 8th grade and then had to drop out of school to take care of her family because my grandfather was killed in a mill explosion, only an 8th grade education. But because of her response to the grace of God, that was not only in her family, but then in her neighborhood, and then in her church, fortified her to be the president of the daycare center that was founded back in the late 1940s. And she maintained that office for 30 years. And advocated above the local church to the Women's Society at the conference level, and then the whole conference. And then they set memorandum on to the general conference. Conference was focused on primarily the question of what is God doing with us, not on political proposals that have theological rationale. You get the subtle but intensive difference. And conference was also a matter of reunion. People looked forward to going to conference because they would see each other. It was very important that we see the people who have covenanted their lives together, clergy and laity, and that we are in the vineyards of God. And I would say to you that if we lose that, we've lost something that is vital amongst Methodists. When I travel throughout the world, my wife has reminded me of that. We hardly go anywhere, and you might think that this is a little boring of us, we hardly go anywhere where we're not meeting with Methodists somewhere. And we always know that we will be welcome, that we will become part of a neighborhood and a church and a home, that we will know of their love that they share for one another and the mission and the ministry that we have in the world. That is the essential connection that we share. It is that we are bonded together by the Holy Spirit in a common covenant and responsibility to respond. And so it was the response to God's grace in larger and larger connection. It was the reunion one with another. Conference. And it was also to seek the advice of the itinerant bishop, the one who was responsible for knowledge of the work of the entire church, to give advice, who was covenanted together with the circuit riders and with the laity. It was said out of these conferences and connections that bishops would itinerate because they were the chief evangelists of the church. And when a bishop came to town and preached in those churches, the bishop would invite not only the Methodists to join, because it wasn't a Methodist club, but would invite all folk of the church to come, clergy and laity. And they would become part of those preaching services. And it was often said that when the bishop came to visit, that locale remained totally Methodist for at least a year. Because the call was not to be a Methodist, but to respond to the grace of God. The call was to feel the love of God shed abroad in your heart and for you to make a difference in the world. The call was not for this to be a private enterprise or a small club or even a denomination that was frozen in its identity, but to be part of the ecumenical church. That love divine, all loves excelling, joy of heaven to earth come down, is for all of the children of the earth, not just those who join our membership, pledge to our budget, populate our pews, but that our yearning that comes out of our conference, our yearning is for the love of God, the prevenient grace of God, to be shed abroad in the land with all of God's beloved children. That was the essence of conference. How are we to faithfully do that? And it grieves me that there are times when I go to conferences where I realize that this is just business. And we're there because we are bound to be there, bound by obligation, rather than bound in a common ministry. I will leave you with what stays with me and gets me over from time to time, and I will share it with you and pray that you will find these experiences for yourself. Having been in the time when you were ordained deacon and then elder, as we are now brought in by a variety of methods, throughout that whole process to get into ministry, arduous as it was, to go through all of the interviews and to be voted and to wait for an appointment, all of those experiences, I will never forget kneeling there in front of the bishop with 15 other people, ready to make my commitment again. The commitment that was made on my behalf at baptism, the commitment that was made to me by every Sunday school teacher I ever had, the commitment that was made to me as people welcome me to worship, welcome me to fellowship suppers, welcome me on my first mission trips, welcome me on my retreats, welcome me on the hope of my life. And that I was to now kneel before the bishop and give my life to our ministry. But as I looked to my right and to my left, I saw the others who were making a similar vow. And it was put upon my heart in that moment that for the next 40 years, I would be in ministry, in conference, in connection, in mission with these. And those who were behind me, who stood up after the questions had been answered and applauded their acceptance, and those who would come after. Together in ministry, together in conference, together to answer the questions. What is it that the prevenient grace of God lays upon us to do in ministry and mission in this place and time? To fulfill our commitment to inclusion, to fulfill our ecumenical goals, to fulfill the love of God shed abroad in the land. And in a day when conference becomes a matter of competition for bigger appointments, in a time of scarcity of salaries and huge and mounting debt for clergy, in a time when churches are dwindling in size and resources, in a time of the theology of scarcity, it seems to me that it is important to remember and to rekindle conference as a matter of grace, a matter of love, and a matter of mission. And that is renewed over and over again as our fundamental bond, not simply a matter of obligation, and to fulfill the political, governmental, and business of an organization called a church.
You are welcome here. Please stay forever. Our love and praises to receive.
I just want to take a couple of minutes to talk about itineration. The itineracy is at the very foundation of the way in which the connection was formulated in the early days. And the word and the concept remains true to this day. But I think it's really important as we read through the discipline together. Later on, when we talk about the orders of elder and deacon, as well as the place of a local pastor, both full-time and part-time, lay ministers, supply, and the rest, to really get a sense of the place of itineracy, even though today, 2014, 2015, 2016, we have located pastors, located leaders. Itineracy for deacons and elders has basically been an argument over who gets to initiate and set an appointment. And we'll talk about the differences between the two. But it's become a conversation largely about the power and the authority of a bishop over a person's life, which is different than what it was in its inception. And so realistically, what I've thought about here, to be clear about this, and I will probably use this phrase as we go along, is that elders are no longer truly itinerant. Elders are serially located. And that has a very important implication as you read about the order of elders. If we are on location, there are certain issues that are not important in terms of who we are within the denomination. And truly, the itinerants of our system now are the bishops. They are the ones who are empowered and enfranchised by the church to itinerate throughout the entire connection. And that is really a very important part of their role. They aren't just bishops of a conference or a diocese. They are bishops of the whole connection. And that can become a problem as well, because if the whole world, there are bishops over the entire world, then they do have their area, and there are bishops who will itinerate within that area. But bishops move. So do district superintendents, and so do general secretaries. And so the general secretaries of the connectional table, the General Board of Higher Education and Ministry, and I'm thinking about them just now, are in various places in the world and will be returning home to where their general boards are located or the offices are located. But they do a great deal of work throughout the world for us. So true itineration is actually now at the general secretary level and at the general board level, as well as at the episcopal level and the district superintendents of the church. But itineracy is also a mark of what it is to be a leader in the Methodist Church from its inception. Itineracy. I've often thought of it as that itineracy to United Methodist leadership has often been the same as celibacy is to the Roman Catholic priesthood. And so there is a struggle when we introduce the permanent deacon in 1996 who is not itinerant. Margaret Ann Crane has just written a brand new book now in the winter of 2014. It just arrived on my doorstep literally this morning, and I'm looking forward to reading it. And we will talk to Margaret Ann about that and about the issue of the identity of itineration and what that has meant in the struggle of our ecclesiology and what it means to be in Methodist leadership. But I want it to be before you that itineration, relationship to one another in conference, relationship to the appointive officer, and willing to move and go where sent was essential to the identity of Methodist leadership, which causes this kind of tension and struggle that we have yet to find words and thoughts about between deacons and elders. And many times, deacons are asked by the appointive officer to itinerate as if they were pastors, to pastor almost as if they were pastors. And that becomes a tension. It's also a tension because local pastors now are not simply local and stationary in one place, but they have been asked to itinerate. And more and more and more, local pastors are itinerants. I'm not arguing against any of these things, but it's confusing our basic understandings of our ecclesiology and what it is to be a leader of the church. And it seems to me that then what it gets to is a matter of who is protected by the benefits and the salary packages of the church rather than the way in which we deploy leadership for missional reasons. This has been an issue in terms of equity between deacons and elders, and we'll talk about the work that is yet to be done in that area, but it is around itineration and the reality of the security of local pastors who are going to itinerate at the bishop's request, but are not fully enfranchised, and in fact have said more often than not that the reason that local pastors are where they are has to do with the salary packages that are inherent there. And so we are in a time where itineration, which was fundamental to the spread of the mission of the church, changed at the time when pastors became located and lived in a local church and became identified in that local area rather than itinerating. So that was one change, but we still called them itinerant because they were subject to the appointment of the bishop. Then we added in 1996 two different orders. They were not the same, deacon and elder, and their relationship to itineration was very different. And so the questions of equity and mission are still with us, although we've come a long way. And now we have the issue of local pastors and elders. Local pastors who are not itinerants but are being asked to itinerate. So what defines them vis-a-vis the elder, except for enfranchisement and permanence in the annual conference. And now that we're trying to talk about guaranteed appointments going away, even that is at odds. So you see the very fundamental of itineration, which we're talking about here, is being shaken to its very foundations. I don't want you to hear me to say that that's bad, just that it is. And that it really does change issues of justice, issues of mission, issues of ministry, issues of what leadership is about in the way in which United Methodists relate to each other. And so as we move through this entire notion of ministry, I want you to think about that at the bedrock. This is an agenda yet to be finished, an opportunity for us, but it's bruising nonetheless, because people are involved. Their identity is involved. Their blessing is involved. The way they are included is involved. And so it's an important question for us to focus on as we move forward. Last little thought that I want to provoke in us is this. If we begin with an understanding the prevenient grace of God and how it is that we nurture that, which is an act of piety, an act of prayer, an act of sharing that in covenant, it is absolutely essential to also understand that those acts of piety, those acts of holiness, cannot remain personal or even in a devotional group. That the essential nature of Methodism, United Methodism itself, is that they work themselves out in social holiness or in justice. And that mission is not simply philanthropy, or even, as some have said, it is the time of year where I get my hands dirty to help other people. It is also an issue of justice. How it is that we are effective in the world in terms of changing and transforming, by the grace of God, the very dynamics by which our society and the society of the world acts. And so it seems to me that inherent in our understanding of the prevenience of grace and what I've just talked about for the last 3/4 of an hour, that we also are very clear that it works itself out in acts of social holiness, or the way in which we are present in the transformation of society. And all of these things that we've talked about are of a piece. We are in a time when we fragment and silo and focus on just one little part of that, and that becomes our agenda, our reason for being. We raise our voice on that. And I know at annual conference many times, if there were certain of my colleagues who stood up, I knew exactly what they were going to say. They said it that way every year. And what a wonderful thing it was when they stood up and talked about something else in the spectrum of what it was to be a Methodist, a United Methodist, that they could connect their personal piety to social holiness, and one was not the threat to the other. When they could talk about the ministry of the laity and itineration and clergy and deacons and elders together in terms of the social upbuilding of the church as well as our piety together. So you get a sense of this. And I simply want to say to you that it's absolutely essential that these remain connected in the way we think about our polity and our governance. The way in which appointments are made are as much about justice and equity as the way in which we think about our involvement and transformation of the world. The way the church acts within itself. It's often driven me crazy when the separation of church and state in the United States is utilized as an excuse for the church to not live into the best ethics which it would commend to the world. And so it seems to me that as you read through the whole of it, all of these pieces are in your mind at the same time. My family, 200 years ago, were Puritans, separatists, Congregationalists. They came over on the Mayflower. I'm very proud of that heritage. And many people throughout the years have asked me, so if you were part of that original group, and yes, on the wall there's the Mayflower Compact, and I can point to the names of those whose blood flows within my veins. So why am I a United Methodist and not a member of the United Church of Christ? I'm a United Methodist because of the social creed. You see, the Pilgrims, unlike the Puritans that were a bit north of them, the Pilgrims stayed in a place of piety, of social devotion, one to another. And at the turn of the century, my grandparents were not mill owners, but still mill workers. They were the ones who would go into the mills day to day and make cloth and make shoes for the world at the time. But the lot of workers was not good. Brown lung in the cotton mills, fingers that were taken off in a moment's notice because of the spinning jennies, explosions because OSHA hadn't come about yet that took the life of my great-grandfather. A mill accident that killed my grandfather. My grandparents came to the Methodist Church because of its commitment that was expressed through the social creed for the transformation of the world, especially focused in those days on the rights of workers. But if you look in our discipline and in our book of resolutions, it is our dedication to complete our devotion, our personal piety, our response to the grace of God, not simply by being comforted that God loves us, but how does that love shed abroad in the world for the world's transformation? And how does that DNA work itself out in every part of our polity? And how is that aligned and focused so that our mission might be fulfilled? That in order for the world to be transformed, we make disciples of Jesus Christ to receive and respond to the grace of God preveniently given, abundantly given, without reservation given, to be responded to by my heart set free and my life given to the mission that is a response to that grace. From the time of Wesley at the foundry, caring for orphans, those in the workhouses, the poor, lending to them so that they could transform their own lives and the lives of the world. Those who were sick so that they might be restored to health and to the fullness of the life that was given to them. It is in the very DNA that we have and should be that is throughout our polity. And so I just took this week to be with you to provoke some of this thinking, and that we are enfranchised by our book of discipline and by how we think about the church to be part of it and its own transformation for the sake of God, the sake of Christ, and the sake of the life of the world. Love divine, all loves excelling. Finish this new creation. I'll see you next week.